Welcome to IndoctriNation, a weekly conversation series about protecting yourself from systems of control. I'm your host, Rachel Bernstein.
Hello, everyone. Today on the show, we have a returning guest, Jonathan Hirsch. He was raised in a cult that was run by a man named Franklin Jones, who went by other names, one of which was D'Offrey John. He's an award-winning podcast producer and executive and host. And Jonathan is the founder of Neon Hum Media, a partner company with Sony Music Entertainment. He has worked on over 100 shows with a dozen number one podcasts, including Bagman with Rachel Maddow, Dateline's The Thing About Pam with Keith Morrison, Very Scary People with Donnie Wahlberg, and Murder on the Towpath with Soledad O'Brien. He's the creator of the original series Smokescreen, now in its 7th season, which includes the investigative podcast documentary Fake Priest and the documentary I Am Rama, The Sellout, Deadly Cure, and most recently the hit series Betrayal on the Bayou. He's a Peabody-nominated producer and the recipient of the Green Eye Shade Edward R. Murrow and DuPont Awards for his reporting and for his production. He's here to talk about his own experience of having a father who became ill, who he needed to take care of, who is the person who had raised him in this cult, and the idea of there being this real conflict, emotional and otherwise, when you need to be the caretaker of a person who you have very conflicted feelings about. Here's Jonathan now. It is delightful to have Jonathan Hirsch back on the show. It's been a number of years, and it's nice to see you, and I'm so happy to be able to continue our conversation or start a whole new one now that time has passed and things have happened.
Awesome.
So welcome back.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, me too. Me too. If you can spend a moment letting people know a little bit about you, which I know is hard to do in a moment. You do a lot of things. And so if you need a couple moments, that's fine too. Go for it.
All right. I will take 1.5 moments.
Okay, perfect.
To lay out who I am and what I do. I'm assuming around the time we last talked was pretty close to the release of my podcast, Dear Franklin Jones. I was raised in a group that many, including myself, believed to be a high control cult group. Not something I really understood or knew at the time that it was happening growing up within that group. But I had a lot of questions as I got older about what it all meant and how to reconcile the very different childhood experience I had from my friends and counterparts and partners and whatnot. And ultimately that led me to produce the series, the podcast documentary series, Dear Franklin Jones, which detailed my life within a group run by a controversial spiritual teacher and guru, Franklin Jones, also known as D'Offrey John, Babakri John, Adida, and a million other names. That show was quite successful at the time of its release, which I was super grateful for. I had become an audio producer at that point, and I went on to start a podcast production company called Neon Hum. And Neon Hum eventually became a partner company of Sony Music Entertainment's podcast division, where I still work. And yeah, I mean, over the course of these many years, I've had the good fortune of being able to report on and tell the stories of a number of high control cult-like groups, not limited to the one that I was raised in. And so I continued to cover that in documentary formats. But also recently I released an audiobook and memoir that goes into a lot more detail about my life inside of Franklin Jones's group. That's coming out this month.
Very exciting. And it's very good timing that you're on. And yeah, there's a lot that I want to be able to get into.
Yeah. where do we begin? And sorry if that was more than 2 moments. I feel like that was a
No,
lot. So
that's really okay. I didn't time it at all. Doesn't matter. I think one of the things that I want to be able to get into, and by the way, congratulations on all the successes along the way. And it's
thank you.
very validating to know that you have a place where you can put your content out and have it heard and have people learn from it, which is, I think, a really wonderful feeling, or I'm sure it's a really wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, doing my best. And certainly didn't think that telling these kinds of stories would be a part of my professional life 10 years ago, but it's where we are.
It's fantastic. So I know that when we talk about being raised in a particular group, it often includes how we were parented
Yes.
in those groups and the decisions that parents made for how to interact with their children, how to even think about their children, how to also, and how much to show affection, how much to discipline based on the ideas or ideals of the particular cult leader. And cult leaders, by and large, really know nothing about child development and about real emotion, I think, also. And so here you have children raised in these, I think it's sort of like a toxic stew of lack of information and lack of interest in the life of a child and what they need, but also the ability to really be in an environment that's healthy with the expression of emotion in general. Because cult leaders are often pretty handicapped when it comes to being able to have real relationships and love and compassion and. So the children often suffer quite a bit. And some of the parents who I work with have what they call a moral injury when they come out and they see, if they come to that place, they see what they did or what they were instructed to do or what they thought was in the best interest of their children and making them, I don't know, good in God's eyes, God being the cult leader, or making them go on the right path, etc., making them strong. And often children really suffer, and sometimes parents too. And also that sometimes children really suffer when the parents don't come to that realization and know that the cult existed squarely between them and their parent, and it just remained there. That the parent didn't sort of find their way around the cult to say, you know what, let's move this out of the way in our relationship so that we can really connect. And I'm sorry for all that I did or put you through. Doesn't often work out that way,
Yes.
even though one wants it to. So I'm wondering if that's something that we can really delve into today.
Absolutely. Everything you said there really resonates with me. When I set about on the journey of making Dear Franklin Jones, I thought of it both as a young journalist wanting to document this group that had not been covered widely. And my degree of access, I think, afforded me an opportunity to tell that story in a way other people may not have seen. But there was a much deeper purpose and mission to that story and to the process of telling it that had to do with questions I needed answered for myself about what I went through as a cult kid. And I do think what you're highlighting here has long been a mission for me, which is I believe that we have egregiously overlooked the experiences and challenges of being a child raised in high control environments in a cult group. Through my work over the last decade, I've had the good fortune of connecting with a number of people who have experienced very similar emotions and problems to the ones that I feel like I've experienced since leaving Franklin Jones's group. And their religious and ideological affiliations were also different. And yet there was a pattern of experience and reaction to that experience and reconciliation that was consistent and not much of a basis for community around those experiences. So I found a lot of people, whether they were Jehovah's Witness or Scientology or extreme Pentecostal groups, the list goes on, sects and subsects that demonstrate those characteristics. And the people who experience them, having inherited those belief systems from their parents as children, what they had to tussle with, and a sense of being alone in that journey. So I appreciate you highlighting the uniqueness of the experience of kids growing up in those environments. And I definitely was driven by a desire to help myself understand precisely what that meant for me through seeking to understand Jones and his group. But there was another piece, which is the second piece of what you said, that is, I think, equally as important, which is for a lot of people, I will say for my parents, when they set about on the spiritual journey of a life that they felt had meaning and that they could come to an understanding about the fundamentals of what life was. And when they landed on a guru, the first one, then the second one, then the third one, which was Franklin Jones, when they landed with him, I was just a baby. But I think to them, this was this incredible opportunity, not only for their spiritual fulfillment and what they would call their transcendence, their transmigration into another dimension or awareness or whatever they thought happened after life. But it was also supposed to be good for me. And I remember as a kid, frequently my parents saying that the spiritual growth that they experienced would somehow help my spiritual growth, almost as if your soul's development, or whatever you want to call it, evolution, was genetic or had like genetic characteristics.
Right.
Which when you try to dissect it a little bit is ludicrous. But at the time, that was all that I knew. And so the environment that I was raised in, not just Franklin Jones, but from my parents, was imbued with this notion that the journey that they were on spiritually was my journey too, and that it benefited me. There was very little discussion when that ended about whether or not that assumption was true. In fact, I think like anybody who has been through a traumatic experience, they wanted to repair themselves and to be made whole themselves. And the pain and loss that they experienced from leaving the group was so overwhelming that there was a lot of interior machinations and struggle that was happening for them. And I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and I mentioned it in my memoir too, which is I remember reading, I was very into poetry when I was a teenager, and being raised by two sort of counterculture hippie type people in the San Francisco Bay Area. I became attracted to the literature of the San Francisco Bay Area and its history and the beatniks and all that. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was at the center of that. He was one of the people who founded City Lights Books, which became kind of this publishing house for the beatnik era of literature. So it was like just one of the things I read along the way as a young person getting into literature. And I remember reading a poem of his, and it just stopped me dead in my tracks the first time I read it, because there was a line in there in which Ferlinghetti says that he was in the back seat of his parents' eternity, reaching out to them. And it's a lovely notion without squeezing it into the metaphor of experience of growing up in a cult, but it hit me in a totally different way, because I absolutely felt like I was in the back seat of what my parents saw as their soul journey, reaching out for some kind of connection. And I see that connection now as parenting.
Yeah, right.
They might resent the mundanity of that characterization, but as a father of two small boys, having been through what I've been through, and I think what the book, The Mind is Burning, Losing My Father to Occult and Dementia, the audiobook and memoir that I just released, is really getting to is how you come back to a place of wholeness and love as a parent, having been through what I've been through, and truly coming to grips with the aspects of those failures in my parents' own life, particularly with my dad, all of this coming into sharp relief when he became sick with dementia. But back to that metaphor piece, I think it's hard to care for others when you don't have the ability to care for yourself. And so you mentioned this earlier, that adults who come out of these groups, often they come out with a sort of moral injury. And I love that term because I think it describes quite precisely the state that my parents were in when they left Franklin Jones's group. And so when I made Dear Franklin Jones, there was a question underneath the entire thing. One question that I felt effectively distilled all of the complexities of me doing a documentary with my parents involved about me growing up in a cult. What do they feel about it? To me, the fundamental question at the heart of that was, are you willing to admit, not even admit, but permit the idea that maybe some of this, not all of it, not even any one particular part of it, but some of this 25 plus year quest to find enlightenment, to find a guru, to evolve into a more spiritually mature person, to find truth, as my dad would have said. Maybe some of that wasn't this linear upward trajectory of growth, that I was not always in the backseat of an eternity that was leading towards something profound or transcendent, that maybe some of it was a mistake, that we can make mistakes in life and that's okay. But for my parents, and especially for my dad, admitting that, permitting that idea was completely impossible for him. When the series came out, we were not in a good place as father and son. And I think I still, up until the release of the show, held this fantasy. There's this idea of like the children of immature parents. And it's like a very pop psychology idea, but I've read some of that stuff and some of it resonated with me in particular when I think about how I related to my parents. One of the ideas that's promoted in this way of thinking about your childhood when you have parents that are self-motivated, self-interested, preoccupied, narcissistic, however you want to describe it, is the fantasy of wholeness with the parent. Like, if I do this, this, and this, we will be together and they will acknowledge me. They will reciprocate my efforts. Their love will come to me. They will step out of their own burdens for a moment and be available to me. And so my fantasy there was, if I'm like the good spiritual student, if I permit them the lies that they tell themselves about their history and where it's going and the hiccups that they've had along the way, then perhaps they will come back to me and be a loving and present and available parent. And so I did, up until the release of Dear Franklin Jones, have this dream of being able to level with them about what it was that we had been through together. And when that was not possible for my dad, he didn't even listen to the show. Well, maybe he did and said he didn't. I don't think he listened. He told me he didn't. But when he wasn't able to do more than respond to what ex-members were pressuring him about for the show and all this stuff, we were effectively estranged. That was the moment of realization for me that there was no healing of that relationship. Though I do think, and I detail this quite a bit in the memoir, I do think I held this hope that's really never goes away, that there'll be this moment when he'll get it. And then he got sick. And all of a sudden, things really started to ratchet up for him around 2018, 19. All of a sudden, there was this sick man that I was the only next of kin for, who didn't have any friends, who lived with his partner, who was entirely ill-equipped to handle the behavior changes that he was experiencing. And thus, for a while, the two of us became responsible for his care. And then ultimately, my wife and I did.
Okay.
So that's the journey that I've been on. And about a year and a half ago, I decided to write about it. We were mostly just quietly dealing with it. There were a couple of moments when I talked about it, but it put a whole new spin on this discussion of the experience of being a child of a cult and how you reconcile with a parent, in part because it was impossible for him to reconcile with me on that point before he got sick. And then when he got sick, we didn't have a relationship. All of a sudden, I was then responsible for him while also trying to run a business and raise kids
Okay.
in the middle of COVID.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's just pile on more and more that made that
Yeah.
difficult and emotional. When you were talking about this population being egregiously overlooked, yes, absolutely correct. There is a lot that happens to people who are raised in a certain way that was not of their choosing. And they have to learn how to make sense of it. And they can see their parents often struggling with trying to make it right. That, like you were saying, that through their attempt at being able to get spiritual enlightenment, they're putting you in a good protective enlightened state too, by association, by trickle down spirituality. And so, I mean, yeah, I suppose if that makes you feel better to justify it in that way, that's certainly not how kids feel. And this idea of that poem of being in the back seat, that is so incredible. And when you were reading it, I was thinking, because my framework is similar to yours, just from being in that space of kids being taken along for that ride.
Right.
I was thinking actually of the movie The Way, Way Back. I don't know if you saw it, but it's about this kid being dragged along to a weekend away with a father who ends up really mistreating him. And he's in the way, way back, having no control, just being taken and not having any say, wanting it to not be as horrible as he's imagining it's going to be. But it ends up being horrible and even more so. And so there's a powerlessness that is already there. Moments like that just make it so much worse when you feel like you're getting farther and farther away. Like I think of sitting in the back. We used to have a station wagon where the back, you could turn the seat around and look behind you. Now I would absolutely throw up. But before it was fun. And then you could just see the road or your home getting farther and farther away. And I just picture you getting farther and farther away from some kind of life that might have felt more like the life that you wanted. And also with talking to people who have parents who are aging or parents who have passed, I do hear those things a lot, that I never got to hear my father say he was proud of me. I never got to hear my mother apologize. There are these moments that we wish for, that we hope for. Sometimes parents are already ill-equipped for, but certainly being in a cult and getting that kind of training for how to be with people in your world and how to think about emotion, you get farther away from being able to give your kids what they would want and what they really need that's really significant, that's life-changing. With this whole issue of these fraudulent teen treatment or residential teen treatment places.
Troubled teen industry. Yeah.
Right. The troubled teen industry, which I cover a lot. I've worked with a lot of families where the child just needs the parent to say, "You're right. I'm sorry. I had no idea. I was being fooled just as you were originally. And you're right. I'm sorry." Not, "Yeah, but you were a handful," or "Yeah, but," no, but yeah, buts. And so
No, yeah, buts.
right? You can come to therapy for as long as you'd like, and as long as you'd like to pay for it, sure, but let me just shorten it for you.
Right.
Just at the beginning of the session, turn to your child and say, "You're right. I'm sorry. I didn't know. And now that I know, I feel really terrible. How can I help you in healing from this?" It will turn everything around. But it's hard sometimes for even a parent to get there because they have to be ready, willing, and able to do that.
Yeah. And I recognize and have written quite a bit about the pain and anguish that my father experienced before he went on his spiritual journey that made it difficult for him to, as we would say today, like be present for both of his children. He was estranged from his first son who passed away before they really had an opportunity to reconcile. And he was a child of war. He grew up in Hungary in the middle of the century, 20th century. He was a so-called 56er. He left Budapest just a handful of months before the Hungarian Revolution. He has injuries that are visible on his face from warfare, from bombs, shrapnel. This is a man who had been through quite a bit and was seeking some kind of release from that pain. I understand. And I think children who put their needs on the back burner for the needs of their parents oftentimes do emotionally, intuitively understand on some fundamental level the pain that their parents are experiencing and permit the primacy of that pain within their relationships to the parent if there's a promise somewhere down the road that the score will be settled. And this, to your point, is what oftentimes doesn't happen in the fallout of these groups. Is the pain for my dad and for my mom was so visceral that they could not step out of it and be apparent to me. And so it only further complicated my feelings towards them and distanced us, as you said, from one another as time wore on. I would have loved for my dad to have had that sense of healing. I think I wished that for him and accommodated his unpleasantries, verbal abuse, emotional unavailability, lack of presence in my life. I accommodated all those things because I wanted whatever healing was going to get him to a place where he could be loving towards me. I wanted. And the closest thing I got to that reciprocation was when I became part of his group. So the only time I ever saw my dad demonstrate that he was proud of me was when I was putting a flower at the feet of his guru.
Right. Wow. My goodness.
Because it validated his deep sense that this person was going to free him from the pain that he felt.
Right.
Now, of course, I feel a sense of urgency about resolving some of these things for myself because I have two boys and I don't want them to experience that. I want them to experience a dad who shows up for them and who is present for their challenges. All of us are going to have personal dilemmas. It's life, but to be able to show up for your kids, I think feels all the more urgent when you're raised by parents who had a hard time with that. It's been a journey for sure.
Absolutely, for sure. And to talk about also the conditionality of the relationship, because when you're talking about showing up for your kids, to me, I hear that as I'm going to show up for my kids where they are.
Yes.
With the thing that interests them and the thing that makes them happy and the sport that I couldn't care less about, let's say, but I will go to the away game at 7 a.m. and right?
Right.
Because it makes them happy. But here with cults, very often it is the thing that makes you feel closer or the thing that drives or promotes a smile, pride, whatever, is a child kind of getting into it and laying flowers at the feet and playing along and reducing the cognitive dissonance for the other person, making it kind of an easier glide path to feel good about the decision that you've made, that even your child is somehow into it, even though I think you probably just learned how to play along.
Yeah. And as a teenager, I did adopt the religion and the practices and tried to will myself into an experience that was complicit with my parents' wishes. But you're absolutely right. It is a performance for any child in that environment, even if they find themselves swept up in it eventually, which I try to grapple with in Dear Franklin Jones, that I did to an extent get swept up in it. And so by the time my parents wanted to leave, I didn't want to leave. So it was very messy emotionally for me. I didn't know what to believe. And so the first assertion of clarity was honesty in the form of the podcast. And my parents not showing up for that was a deep disappointment. And and then I think you start to get older and experience some success in life, and you have responsibilities and children, and it becomes all the more important to come to peace with those things. And so part of what we went through when my dad got sick, or what this book has afforded me the ability to process in real time, what's my bucket list that I need to check off to let this person go and to move on from it? Because he's never going to give me that satisfaction of meeting me where I am. I was fortunate enough sort of to be going through therapy at the time that I began writing Minus Burning. And I appreciate my therapist very much. And the focus of his work is often around creatives and how storytelling and narrative can be a healing force in people's lives. And so I certainly recognize that storytelling was always both an escape and a tool to confront the things that scared me. And so through the process of writing this, I also was almost processing what was going on for me in real time. To be clear, my father is still alive. He's in a memory care facility a few miles from our house. I'm both his next of kin and responsible for his care, both practically and legally. But he's in a state now where it's a much more advanced stage of dementia. It's not really able to have those kinds of conversations.
Right. It's a very, very difficult thing to have a parent who is in, I see it as limbo. They're there. And then how much are they able to connect and be present? My father passed away when I was young, when I was 22, and he was so much a part of my life and my work that I do. And so I think about him a lot. And I was just talking to a sibling the other day about how I feel guilty that I don't go to the cemetery to visit very often because I don't picture him there. He's a voice kind of in my head. I have integrated this person, and I imagine, what would he say in this situation, or how would he handle this? And he had sort of just innate, also gentle parenting. When things get tense and I get quiet, let's talk about this. I think, thanks, Dad. Like I have that. But still, you really do want, as you are becoming a parent, you want to be able to have something that feels multi-generational if possible. But also just becoming a parent, period, I'm sure was revelatory in so many ways for you, that here, these little people at these ages, would I expect them to be able to fill in the blank what kids in cults are expected to do, or expected to forfeit, expected to go without?
Sacrifice for the mission.
Sacrifice for the mission, right? Or sit still or meditate for hours, or have to, as you write about, earn affection and earn love, and that it's not just unconditional. It's a very different thing for you as a former SGA, someone who's second generation, but also somebody who then becomes a parent. And then I think you really feel it in a whole other way.
everything you just said does really resonate with me. It's interesting. I detail this a little bit towards the end of the book, of the memoir. How do I let this person go? What recognition, what experiences do I need to let this person go? And back to the earlier point we were discussing, oftentimes it's just about clarity. It's just about the communication of inability, the space that you make for a person to express their true experience that becomes a healing moment. So if you are the child of someone raised in a cult and your parents made you sacrifice many of the things that would have given you joy or helped you grow in service of the mission of the group, and when that period in all of your lives is over and that child, let's say, confronts their parent about that experience, you were talking about the troubled teen example, and I'm sorry is often enough for some people. An ability to express your experience without qualification is enough. It doesn't have to be that person emoting some meaningful expression of conciliation or sympathy necessarily. Like, I wasn't personally needing my dad to come to me and be like, son, I am so sorry for everything I've put you through. I see now how difficult it's been to be my son and the things that you've done to make my life better. I wasn't going to get that from him. I hadn't up until this point in my life. And there was no reason to believe, as his mental state deteriorated, that it was going to get any better. So what is it in that moment that is going to make me feel like I can close the book on this and move on with my life? And I'll tell you, one of the moments that continues to resonate for me was when I went to see him after my wife and I found out that we were going to have another boy. He doesn't hear very well, is constantly losing hearing aids or malfunctioning. And even with them, it's not very effective. So they have this little sandwich board, or not even like, just like a little mini whiteboard near his bedside, and you could write things to him. So I came to see him about 2 years ago as we were anticipating a new family member in our life. And we knew it was a boy. I wrote on the board that we had there to sort of write his little notes. You hear very well. We were going to have another son. And something about the level of mental awareness that he now possesses being so low, and his lack of inhibition in general, his reaction to that was so unvarnished. And he just looked at the words, and when he recognized what it meant, this like cloud of fear like hung over his head and like just colored his whole expression, like as if he was saying, oh my God, that's awful. And he literally said, oh no.
Wow.
I wasn't surprised by his reaction.
Okay.
Because as shocking as it was for most people, I would think, it was typical of him. And I think if I take that reaction in concert with everything else I knew about this man, it made sense. And somehow just the complete clarity of that reaction, that we were bringing a son into the world, my wife and I, and that his first reaction was panic. And he said something shortly after that, like, now you really can't escape. And he was kind of out of it. You know what I mean? He has dementia. So some of the stuff you really can't equate with like the true state of mind of that person consistently. But that reaction was a form of closure for me, because I recognized that to this person, truly all the way up into the very last days of his life, was not going to be able to look past what he had been through and to show up available, loving, and ready for someone else who needs you completely. Not saying that isn't hard for all the parents out there to be that way for your kids all the time, but it's not what our kids are asking of us. I think that the sad thing for him is that showing up in that way never happens, or there's never a moment where it happens for him because he can't ever let go of his preoccupation with the emotional suffering that he's experienced, the physical suffering he's experienced, and what he believes is going to be the resolution of that conflict, internal conflict in his life, the spiritual search, the quest.
So fascinating. Oh my goodness. There's so much to respond to here, just as a fellow child of and parent and someone who studies the psychology of all of this, as someone who has a teaching credential and knows about child development and et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. There's so much to talk about here. Yes, I could imagine it would be very validating, kind of solidifying, helpful in some ways to see someone react in such a primal way, in a way that's so naturally different from you. And it highlights a couple things, I think. One is his genuine limitations, and that he was sort of, I think, not choosing to be an emotionally abandoning parent, but he was coming from this place that I think of the polyvagal theory, this idea of people who have been traumatized, that their mode in the world is for protection rather than connection.
Yes.
And so they need to know that they can jump into something that's going to make them feel safe, and attachments make them feel unsafe. Responsibility for someone else's feelings make them feel unsafe. You then having another son, it's like in his mind, all hell is going to break loose, because that's probably how life felt when it wasn't in this controlled space, devoid of emotion a lot of the time, which it probably felt a lot safer for him. It's very interesting. Wow.
Yeah. Everything you said really resonates with me because I do feel at the heart of it, he was seeking some kind of protection, some kind of solace in his life. And it was so deeply ingrained in who he was and so much a part of the biological, emotional organism that he was. He couldn't work his way out of it, not without help. A friend of mine, Stephanie Fu, wrote this incredible book called What My Bones Know, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. And when I first read her book, it's really about coming to grips with her own childhood experiences and discovering the diagnosis of CPTSD,
Okay.
complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I would recommend anyone listening to this who's interested in this topic to read that book. But I think the metaphor at the heart of the book that really resonates with me, and I see in a little bit in my own experience and definitely in my dad's, was it became such a deep part of his body, the trauma that he'd experienced, that he wasn't really able to isolate it in any one thing. It was sublimated. It became a part of the organism, this search for protection, support, love, safety, absorption in something bigger than him that could become his new self. I mean, the all-powerful, all-knowing, godlike figure who you literally meditate on to become absorbed by. Sound familiar?
Wow.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
He wanted that freedom that he thought absorption in a divine consciousness or whatever would afford him. But then for the rest of us here on our own 2 feet on planet Earth, the search for that thing left him completely gone from the emotional and physical lives of the people who were around him, who were technically supporting him. And so I saw the almost childlike desperation at times when he would feel like he was losing his grip, or he'd be in the sway of one of these paranoid fantasies that he was having for a while about his partner cheating on him with his doctor. We talk about this a lot in the memoir. I talk about it a lot in the memoir. He began to believe that his partner was having an affair with his doctor, and she would go to work for long stretches of the day and come back, and he would be in the middle of the day, he'd be like ramping up and beginning to really lose touch with reality. And that was sort of the beginning of the realization amongst the people around him that he was no longer able to care for himself or be alone. And a lot happened that we talk about in the memoir where I talk about. But yes, I think it's funny in those moments when he seemed desperately in need of some help or support or grounding. I was existing as a person on my own self in two emotional states at the same time. One that I think very coldly, objectively recognized that this was a function of his fear and emotional state. And then the other as his child who saw him needing me, it felt like for the first time. And so this is an embarrassing part of the story that I had to confront, embarrassing for me. When it became clear that he could no longer care for himself, we placed him in a memory care facility. And then shortly after placing him in that facility, the first lockdowns of COVID happened. And it took us a couple of years to get him out of the facility that he was in into another one. And when we moved him out of the facility that he was in the San Francisco Bay Area, we moved him down to Los Angeles to be closer to us. And even then, we're talking 6 years into a legitimate dementia diagnosis. And I'm in the back of my child brain and heart thinking, well, maybe this is the moment that's going to get better. Maybe this is the moment when we reconcile. Maybe what needed to happen is all of this. And then I'm going to move him into this place down the street from us. I'm going to drive out there and bring in copies. We're going to have a relationship. So the childlike part of me, I don't think will ever stop seeking that reciprocity, but it's taken a long time to get to a place. And I think the process of telling the story has helped me to understand how truly impossible that would be. And it required me having a complete understanding of him, which I think I've been on the journey to try to get to for a while.
Yeah. And it's an important, very important thing to do, to really know your parent, to know the people in your life who impact you, to understand them so that you also have a sense of what's realistic. And also that it doesn't need to come with self-judgment, that it wasn't about you and you not mattering enough to him. And that's a really important piece of this, that it's not something you didn't do enough of or something you could have done differently. This was ingrained and this was trauma fueled. So he was just getting by. And everything else, I think, was just icing. I don't know how he did all that he did with all that he went through, but I think we don't give up on that hope. Whether it is that we want an apology or we want a relationship or we want one more conversation, we don't give up on that. And to add to that too, it is human nature to imagine that what is true for us can be true for other people. What we are inherently capable of doing and being, we assume that's the case for others. When you meet a flat out sociopath who has no conscience and you keep thinking is a nice person, it keeps disappointing you. And you're like, oh, who is this snake in the grass of a human? But you keep thinking, oh, if I just say it right or just over time they'll mature. That is who they are. And it is good to just see that. You have to be ready to give up the hope of something in someone else, but especially with a parent. So there's nothing to be embarrassed about. This is what we all want. And I think what we all want forever, as long as we can integrate the message that if we don't get it, it didn't have to do with us.
Yeah, I appreciate that sentiment. And I think that became very clear to me in that moment that I talked about a little bit earlier, when his reaction was so complete and his fear for the existence of another child that needed love and support, protection, and everything. I guess he must have been thinking as a proxy from him, was daunting. That was not the reaction I had. I found out that we were going to have another child. That was definitely not the reaction I had. it was about accepting that reality. It's terminal that allowed me to move on. And I hope people, when they hear my story, can find some solace in the sort of internal emotional dilemmas that I try to detail. And yes, I think having that stuff out and in the light is healing in and of itself, to be able to say it out loud.
Yeah. And you're in a group of people that's bigger than I think people realize. That when you have parents who get involved in a system like following Joffrey John and Franklin Jones, all the other monikers, so many, you have a parent sometimes, not always. And this is not to blame the person who gets involved, but sometimes you have people who really are struggling and people who have limitations, people who have been traumatized, people who haven't found their fit in the world and are looking for kind of an alternate universe. And here suddenly they become parents and responsible for a little person who is potentially going to be raised by someone who is ill-equipped, who then thinks they're equipped by following the teachings of the leader. But it takes them farther afield from being the kind of parent really that they need to be. So kids very often who are raised in a similar way to you talk about feeling like they had to fend for themselves. They had to figure it out on their own. They had to figure out how to parent. They had to figure out how to feel about themselves. They had to figure out how to have a relationship with this person. There's a lot that you do that can create a lot of feeling of independence, even at a young age, to have to figure this all out.
100%. Yeah. And I definitely feel that way. I look at my wife, her experience of being raised by two parents, having two siblings in a pretty stable, consistent household, went to grade school and high school in the same town with the same friends. And her instincts and body of, I don't want to say body of knowledge, but like the toolkit that she had coming into being a parent was to be able to look back at what her parents did and say, okay, well, they did this with me in that situation. I don't feel like I had that toolkit going into being a parent. And much of that had to do with the fact that my parents were largely absent from a lot of those decisions and they weren't really available, nor did they invest in being a parent themselves in such a way that would make it clear to me that this was a part of who they were. My dad had reactions to things that I would do when it interfered with things he wanted, but my father never showed up at a basketball game. He never took me to a friend's house. He never spent time with my friends' parents. He never made relationships with people, with parents who were parents of my friends. He never started a project with me. He never taught me anything consistently. We never did things together. He never built a Lego set with me. He never took me for a walk. He never took me swimming. I mean, the list goes on and on. I write about this in the memoir. Like at one point, I tried to do an inventory of my childhood, like a detailed inventory. What are the memories? What are your core memories? What happened? Just write it all out. And when I went through that list, I couldn't find him. He wasn't there.
Cool.
I went through the entire list and here was a man who was in the other room in the house, but not there. And so when I became a dad, I didn't have a dad that I could look at and say, whoa, okay, when I was busing, when I was 5, like I did this, or these were the things that my dad did around the house to make sure the kids all felt kid, but like to make sure everybody was entertained or none of that stuff. There was no precedent whatsoever because this person was absent from my life, even though he was in the same house. And that I do think is not unique to me in the sense that, especially in the more collectivist environments that many of these cults operate out of, you not only have parents that are preoccupied with the needs and the mission of the group, but then you have the group collectively responsible for the parenting of the children. At one point, Franklin Jones's group did try to start a school. That wasn't a mitigated disaster.
Okay.
And unsurprisingly, right?
Right.
So yeah, I think it's an extra task that I had to do in my life to try to find out what parenting meant to me, not only what it meant to me, but also like how I wanted to do it without much of a point of reference to go off of.
Yeah. That's very hard from scratch. It's nice that your wife had some ideas about that.
Very grateful for her and for her family and for my mother-in-law and my sister-in-laws who did show up as family for each other and did recognize the intergenerational needs of parent to child to parent to child and down the line. That has been a support system, I think, for us and for me that I didn't really see growing up.
There's this quote about how powerful it is when you're an adult to become the person you needed when you were younger.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not even just for your children, but for yourself. To become that internalized parental figure for you, the encourager, the protector, whatever it is. It's very powerful. And it's a bit of a loss when you don't hear it in a parent's voice, but it's still powerful even when you hear it in your own. Where can people find you and your books and your podcast, all of it? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, you can find Dear Franklin Jones on any podcast app if you just search for it. The book, the memoir, is going to be out in a few days from us talking, but
By the time it's out. Yeah.
by the time this is out, everybody will be able to get it. It's called The Mind is Burning, Losing My Father to a Cult and Dementia. It's out from Simon & Schuster Audio. It will be available on any platform that you might listen to an audiobook on. You can find me. You can just go to themindisburning.com and find it there if you're not sure. And I'm on all those social media platforms, Instagram, X, LinkedIn, whatever, under Jonathan Hirsch. Yeah, would love to hear from folks who might hear this and have questions or similar experiences that they want to share. My DMs are always open.
Nice. And I'll pass along messages too that come to me.
Please do. That would be great.
Yeah. A total pleasure. Very insightful, powerful conversation. And I wish you well.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
Good luck with it all. And hopefully we'll be in touch again.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on the show. I'm super grateful. I'm grateful to your audience that cares about these issues. And I hope that they found it beneficial too. So thank you so much.
One more thing before you go. Thank you so much to Jonathan Hirsch for sharing so many important stories with us today, his experiences, his internal conflict. Also, so much about the needs of people born and raised in cults and how they are not really talked about. I know that was never something that I learned when I was learning to be a therapist. I never even really learned about cults. I taught myself through meeting with people, through talking to people, through going to conferences, through my own readings. But the special and significant and unique challenges for people born and raised in cults is a real thing. And it's something that I talk a lot about on the show for that reason. I really want people to understand it, and I want people who have been through those experiences to feel understood. One of the things that Jonathan talked about that is actually one of the issues for people born and raised in cults, and sometimes even for people who got involved later on, is this idea of what I call trickle-down protection. That you think that if you're in a cult, if you're with someone who is enlightened, if you are with someone who God looks after, and if you're following what they're telling you to do, and you're living the quote-unquote right way according to that group, that then you will be protected. It will be trickled down from whatever God figure you pray to or ascended master or whatever it is, through the leader, through you following what the leader tells you to do. So many people who I talk to think back on things that they did while they felt that they were under some sort of spiritual protection, the chances they took, the risks they took. And some people actually miss that feeling of confidence, even if it's misguided, even if it's overinflated, even if it's just not accurate. But it is something that feels really, really good. I know there are a lot of women who talk about that in terms of men, that men will say, hey, why don't you meet me at the park at night and we'll hang out? And the woman is thinking, I need to walk to the park at night, or I'm going to hang out. What if I'm waiting? What if I'm there by myself? What's going to happen to me? In a way that most men wouldn't be considering and having to worry about. And so there are a lot of people within our world who are going to worry about things that other people don't. But it's also true that a lot of people in cults will talk about having walked down a dark alley because they knew they were under some sort of spiritual protection, some force field. They knew they were being watched out for. And this idea that some people have, if they get on a plane and they see people who are religious, orthodox in their religion, well, then they think that the plane is protected because there are people on the plane who are more religious than them, and God will reward everyone on the plane by virtue of protecting them. So there are a lot of people who have these ideas because they feel really good. It's ultimately important to feel protected, to know that someone has your back. There is a lot about child development that we learn about a child's growing independence and what happens when children start to be able to be mobile. They might crawl away from a parent and then walk away from a parent. But still, if it's a healthy attachment, they will turn back to make sure the parent or a caregiver, whoever was taking care of them that day, is still there and is still watching. And so you see this idea of checking, that kids will gain a little more distance from the caregiver, but look back to check. And it feels really good to know that someone's watching. In fact, there are a lot of children who will talk about feeling anxious and having anxious attachments, sometimes because when they looked back, no one was watching. And so if you have the sense that overall there is some spirit that is watching you, so it doesn't matter if your parent is watching you or not, you are still protected. How wonderful. What a wonderful thought. The only problem is that some people really put themselves in harm's way and take a lot of risks and push themselves past the point of safety, or think that they don't need to take medication for something that would be able to be treated by medication, and they just languish and suffer, hoping to be protected, hoping for some spirit, something, some force to swoop in to guide them, to protect them. And when it doesn't happen, they blame themselves, or they let the group blame them. Well, it's because you must have done something wrong, or you didn't believe enough, or your belief wasn't pure enough, or you must have made a mistake in some way. And that gets integrated, that gets kind of internalized, where people start to think that about themselves. What did I do wrong that I'm not being saved, that something bad still happened to me? So when it causes people to blame themselves, or when it causes people to put themselves in real needless danger, that's when it becomes an issue. It's also important that people know that when they leave a particular cult group, they're not necessarily leaving a certain amount of safety. They're not leaving that magic behind. They still have just as much as they did before. And what they had before may or may not have been real, but it doesn't diminish once you leave a cult. And in fact, from all the people I've talked to, a lot of them actually feel safer after having left. They feel like they're in a world now that actually is going to care about how they feel. They can access doctors to help them if they are ill, if they feel like they can push themselves to do it. And that the world is going to reach in at times to wonder about them and check in with them and is not going to blame them for everything going wrong in their lives and in their bodies. And so sometimes it does feel a lot safer in the world outside. And so I don't want people to feel like they have to stay within a group that might be neglectful of them or abusive of them just because they're worried about leaving some form of protection. It just hasn't happened that something bad, from what I've seen in my 34 years of doing this, that something bad is going to happen to you immediately after you leaving or because you left. It also is important for people to learn how to protect themselves and how to notice if someone's following them. I mean, you might not even think it's an issue. You might hear footsteps behind you, but you might not turn around, or you might not go to find a streetlight to make sure that you're in an area that's illuminated because you think that God's protecting you. And there are a lot of people who, again, have said to me, I really did not know that that person was still going to attack me while I was in the cult. It wasn't supposed to happen. So I didn't know how to take steps on my own behalf to protect myself. And so much of what we talk about on this podcast is about how to keep yourself safe. So I wanted to make sure to talk about that today. That you still, even if you're a believer, when you're crossing the street, you still want to look both ways. Take good care. Talk to you next week.
Thank you very much for listening. Please support IndoctriNation on Patreon at patreon.com/indoctrination. Be sure to give us a follow on our social media. Find us on Facebook and Instagram using @IndoctriNation Podcast. And for Twitter, find us at @_indoctrination. We love hearing from you too. So send us an email at indoctrinationshow@gmail.com. And for more updates on the show, visit our website at www.podpage.com/indoctrination.